How does your party actually feel about his fitness for office right now?
I hope the Democrats don't see through this.
I think that this is a real template for what could be the move of the future.
Republicans really need to pay attention to this one.
It is Political Rehab, our mashup of PTI and The Daily Show. Today, the great escape, Caroline Leavitt leaving, AOC goes ballistic on wokeness, I stir up Supreme Court controversy, and CNN goes up for sale. Plus, our weekly look at the midterm battlefield has some big new numbers and big new movement in prediction markets. But let's get right to our rundown. Okay, this is real. If you haven't heard about it yet, on July 8th in Turkey, President Donald Trump faked his own exit from Air Force One. He walked up the stairs of the plane on camera, then secretly slipped out through a catering container. Remember, this is real. I'm not making this up. Was smuggled onto a military jet and flew to England in total secrecy while the plane full of journalists and staff who thought he was still aboard took off first as a decoy for missiles. That's great. This was a real threat to the life of the president, but the reason he was vulnerable in the first place is that he'd been flying around in a lavishly gifted Qatari 747 that didn't have the security infrastructure of an actual Air Force One. So this whole humiliating scramble was substantially self-inflicted. Matt, between the catering cart escape and the obvious physical toll the job is taking on him, how does your party actually feel about his fitness for office right now? Defend your boy.
We've come a long way from George W. Bush flying in to a war zone to Trump being smuggled out in a catering crate and having everybody else be a decoy. Look, the job of the Secret Service is protect the president, and I applaud them for their creativity. The whole controversy here, I don't quite see it the same way as the media wants to talk about this. The plane shouldn't have been used as a decoy, and we need to investigate why the military, Secret Service, and U.S. intelligence service even allowed Air Force One to take off. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is the United States president was under a direct threat during a NATO meeting. How could this happen? It means intelligence and security breakdowns far before this moment. We have a serious intelligence issue here that needs to be looked at because we never should have gotten this far.
Oh, congratulations, Matt. Under Donald Trump, you've gone from the party of Lincoln to the party of Slinkin. Not since Arnold Schwarzenegger's protagonist ended up with a towel wrapped around his head in Total Recall has a supposedly macho protagonist looked so weak and ridiculous. Look, I would like to extend a little bit of sympathy to the president of the United States who was under a threat to his life. There have been actual assassination attempts against this US president before, except for the genesis of this was all in him taking this Qatari bribe, this lavish, ornate bribe from Qatar of a 747 Air Force One replacement without the needed security on it to protect him. And that's how he ended up sneaking around inside a catering cart. He brought that on himself.
And if you want to watch some great memes on it, the internet has won this one completely. It is fantastic if you want to watch it. Let's switch gears. Caroline Leavitt is leaving the White House. There is some speculation online that she's leaving because she was left on the decoy plane. I don't know if that's true. The internet likes to lie, but it might be part of it. Matt, what do you make of her leaving? And what do you think of the job that she's done so far?
I think everyone in the Republican Party can sympathize with the idea of leaving to spend more time lying to your family. Caroline Leavitt has had a disastrous but clowning tenure as White House press secretary. Her opening line at her very first briefing in January of 2025 was a promise to, quote, hold myself to the truth, which she followed immediately by a lie. A false claim about the Biden administration giving out condoms in Gaza, which was bullshit. Her entire job seemed to be to attempt to belligerently launder whatever lie was floating through the transom of Donald Trump's brain at the moment to placate him, please him. She claimed that tariffs are a tax cut for the American people. She claimed that Trump's tax and spending bill, the one big beautiful bill, does not add to the deficit. She made up stuff about the egg shortage. Look, every White House press secretary says things that are a spin. That's their job, right? They're trying to put as good a face as possible on this. She took this to such an extreme. She should not have another job in media. She should not have another job in politics. She has disqualified herself, but she's going to get such a job, probably from Fox, which is probably where she got spawned in the first place.
Look, she has been no different than previous White House secretaries in the fact that their job is to lie for the president. We saw this in the Biden administration when the press secretary said she could barely keep up with Biden. We know that was a bold-faced lie.
All right, that is fair. That is fair.
Right. But here's the biggest difference, and here's where I think you and I agree, is that we have gone from treating the press as an adversary to treating them as the enemy. And to me, that is the fundamental problem with Caroline Leavitt. She's done a great job as far as doing Trump's bidding, but she has just gone to treat them like the enemy. And I think the next press secretary is going to be even worse. And that's a detriment to the American public.
Speaking of waking up, I felt like I did one of these. What? Earlier this week when AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, did a woke walk back. She actually said, quoting someone else's observation, that woke 1.0 was crazy. This could just be political positioning, or it could be some real deep thought. Matt, what is your read on what's going on here?
So I'm going to say something I never thought I would ever say. I think I agree with AOC. Woke one was crazy, but I don't for a minute believe she's changed her positions. I think she's trying to get herself set up to run for president in 2028. And I think she still believes every single thing that she did. This is like Gen Z telling employers not to pay attention to their social media because they were just young and stupid. The difference is she was a congresswoman at the time, and she does believe all this wackadoodle stuff. I think she's just trying to pull it back and make it look less crazy so that maybe she has a hope to run for president. I hope the Democrats don't see through this because I would love to run against her in 2028.
I can't disprove your contention, and I lobbed it up myself, that she's just political positioning here, right? That said, this does come at a moment where there is a reckoning happening. More thoughtful members of the DSA remind me of that line from Almost Famous. They're a mid-level band struggling with their own limitations in the harsh light of stardom. They have had a surge this summer, which means more self-avowed Democratic socialists or people who are friendly to Democratic socialists in office or in running prominently in big races. And that comes with a certain amount of responsibility and a certain amount of introspection about some of the more outlandish positions that DSA leadership has taken, including in their platform, which calls for the end of prisons. No more prisons in America, no more borders in America, and openly praises communism and treats Cuba as a model. These are far extreme positions that most Democrats absolutely abhor, me included. And so I think that there is a real reckoning going on inside AOC's head. I'm not sure. And I think it's a healthy one if it creates space for the same thing to happen with other progressives.
There was a story that made its way out this week on the Washington Post that Donald Trump has made it clear that he will not take Supreme Court decisions as the final word on some of the most cherished priorities, seeking ways around rulings on tariffs, birthright citizenship, and the Fed. Experts say the moves don't signal outright defiance, but they push the court's limits. Matt, you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier offline. You have a little bit of a different take here. What do you think?
Okay, warning, I'm going to probably bust through our usual 3-minute time frame for these rundown topics here because I do have a bit of a counterintuitive here. Look, of course, it's easy and clear to say that Trump is acting lawlessly when he thumbs his nose at the Supreme Court, but it's also worth challenging the underlying premise. This is a great episode of The West Wing, if you ever watched it. They have a whole episode about the idea of not accepting the premise of a question that comes to you. And in this case, the premise here is that judicial review, where the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of what is constitutional, what is not, what is allowed in our society and what is not, what is legal and what is not. That idea of judicial review, that's the premise that's being presumed here, that everything the Supreme Court says has to be the final word. I don't agree with that because, for one thing, that is not in the Constitution. That is a right that the Supreme Court gave to themselves. It's a power that they inferred in the Constitution, that they delegated to themselves as far back as Marbury versus Madison, and that we have subsequently gone along with. If you believe in originalism, strict constructionism, or any other conservative judicial philosophy that has at its core a belief that what we are allowed to do in our country is written out in the Constitution, the idea that the Supreme Court gets the final say is not in there. And I will tell you something else. In my view, the Supreme Court is the most broken of our three branches of government. The fact that the presidency, the executive branch, has become so broken is because the Supreme Court has allowed it to become so, especially recently under Donald Trump, by giving him immunity and impunity. Just to bring this full circle, it is bad when Donald Trump acts above the law, acts outside the law, says that he gets to declare what the law is. But I'm not sure that the corrective is going back to the premise that the Supreme Court, the unelected judges in a deeply corrupt, and we know that these justices, many of them are corrupt, Clarence Thomas, John Roberts, the idea of going back to the Supreme Court to fix it, that I don't accept. I think that the corrective here is to once again elevate the branch of government that is listed first in the Constitution, in Article 1, the Congress, and to have the branch of government that is closest to the people, where all power should derive in a democracy, have that branch of government be the ultimate arbiter of what is allowed, what is legal, and what is constitutional in America. I think that's a proposition that's at the very least worth discussing and not blithely assuming.
I 100% agree with you. The real institutional failure here is Congress. They have spent decades handing power to presidents because voting on things is hard and politically dangerous. And now Trump is testing those limits to the absolute nth authority. And Mike Johnson has failed as speaker. And the real problem that we have here is we don't have three branches of government working. I agree with you 100% that Congress is this failure.
And I'll tack on one more. Again, I'm the Democrat here. I'm not necessarily the best ambassador to our more conservative friends, but for people who are constitutional conservatives, like the traditional core of what used to be the Republican Party, those of you who are pro-life and who objected to the Roe v. Wade ruling because it inferred rights, it found rights within, as they wrote in the ruling, the penumbra of what is written in the Constitution. Ask yourself if the exact same mechanism, which is essentially how the court gave itself judicial review in Marbury versus Madison, is any more just in the power assigning itself this unconstitutional authority than it was under Roe v. Wade. Wow, that was quite a deep dive. Let's get to a much, much shallower dive. Let's talk about news media, which is about as vapid as you can get. Last we checked in, Paramount had a $110 billion bid active to buy the parent company, Time Warner, of CNN. The DOJ under Donald Trump has tacitly blessed this after receiving some praise and a little bit of backsheesh from David Ellison. 12 state attorneys general aren't buying into it one bit, and they have brought suit. And now Paramount is offering to sell off CNN entirely to make the lawsuit go away. Matt, what do you read into this?
What I read is it's a bargaining chip, because the other piece of this story is there's looking to be a board that's going to be an independent advisory board on some of this. I think CNN is losing ratings day in and day out. They're tanking in the numbers. So I think it's a bargaining chip. I don't know if they will actually sell it, but it definitely shows how bad the media is and how segmented we're becoming, where a news organization that revolutionized 24-hour news, that set the standard for it, is now so far gone that it could be bargained away and sold in just a blatant effort to buy their way into an approval to make more money. News is going very corporate. That's why you're seeing all these other outlets, because 24-hour news like CNN is becoming less and less reliable as it tries to market to different segments and plays to the corporate ownership.
In a very meta way, I had a slip of the tongue a few minutes ago when I said Time Warner. That's from a previous corporate merger. Now the entity is Warner Brothers Discovery, from a different corporate merger that preceded this attempted corporate merger. And look, corporate ownership of media has become especially fraught these days as corporations have knuckled under to pressure from Trump. No one has gone further than Paramount. But what really jumps out to me here is just how much all of this is working from these 12 attorneys general. It really creates a template for much more active enforcement of what's supposed to be federal law and federal enforcement from the state level, because we now know that the Trump administration will not enforce the law. They're not going to actually act in the public's interest. It is back to these attorneys general. And by the way, they have every ability and every right to do this kind of thing for lower levels of the Trump administration, to go after DOJ staffers who break privacy laws when they break into the Social Security Administration. I think that this is a real template for what could be the move of the future. Speaking of where we're going in the future, it is time for our weekly look at the battlefield, where there's been some major maneuvering in the last few days.
The polls are shifting. The map is changing. The fight for Congress is on. This is the battlefield.
All right, we always do this battlefield segment like we're the Brady Bunch getting divorced. 3 for you, 3 for me. Let's do your 3 things that you have been watching in the past week. What's your number 1?
Republicans really need to pay attention to this one, because there were primaries in Minnesota and Wisconsin. The biggest issue for voters in those 2 states was ability. You saw that in poll after poll. Yes, there's some anti-Trump sentiment baked into that, but people showed up in these 2 states because prices are too high, things are too expensive. Democrat turnout was very high. This is a warning sign for Republicans, and we need to be paying attention, because voter enthusiasm is high and they're all pissed off about the economy.
Did you find this week's primary results, from your perspective as a Republican, encouraging or discouraging? Obviously, Democrats got the more moderate nominee for governor in Wisconsin over the DSA member, Francesca Hong. That would seem to be a sigh of relief for Democrats. On the other hand, in the Senate primary in Minnesota, you've got the slightly more progressive lieutenant governor who's got the whole state Medicaid scandal hanging a little bit more over her. So what was your overall takeaway from these primary results from a Republican perspective?
What was interesting is the polls were so wrong on what was going to happen. And that's because they're oversampling people that are much more natural to Hong and much more natural to the socialists. So when I look at these numbers, I actually had a little bit of alarm on what's happening from a Republican perspective. In Minnesota, Michelle Tafoya is a standout candidate. She's going to be able to raise a ton of money, but celebrity candidates in recent years haven't done very well. I think Michelle Tafoya is going to be a strong candidate, but I'm not sure she's going to be able to pull it off in Minnesota. If you just look at the numbers, almost 700,000 people voted for Democrats compared to the 400,000 Republicans. Democrats are enthusiastic, and it's not necessarily getting picked up in the polls in the right way. And I think that spells trouble for Republicans.
I'll just quickly say that I'm picking up that vibe on the Democratic side, that this whole brewing civil war between progressives and moderates, both sides are willing to do the détente thing for the next 82 days. El Sayed got immediately embraced by national Democratic leadership. So I agree with your read completely. Give me your number 2.
Senate Republicans' top super PAC is pouring in an extra $6 million into Michigan to attack the Democrat Senate nominee. It really shows a commitment to what we're going to do in Michigan. They are throwing some more money in Alaska and Iowa too to shore that up. but I still continue to think the Republicans' bright light of this cycle is going to be Michigan. I do think Republicans are going to be able to win this because I think Al Said has some problems. It is going to be a close race, but if I'm predicting right now, I'm going to say Republicans pick up Michigan, but that will be our only win of the cycle.
Wow, this is right in line with what you said last week on this show, that you anticipated that Michigan was now the opening with Al Sayed as the nominee for the Democrats. I will note that this week, Mary Peltola jumped out to her first polling average lead in Alaska. So I think if Senate Republican PACs are playing in Alaska, they're actually playing for real right now, based on at least the public polls. And in Iowa, look, if I had told you a year ago that your side was going to have to be spending money to protect Iowa, you would have not felt good. So welcome sign from Democrats' perspective. All right, what's your number 3?
Donald Trump this week pivoted the nation's attention back to vaccines with an executive order that takes aim to scale back childhood immunization schedule and space out shots into separate visits. The reason this is in the battlefield is that strategists and even Trump's own pollster, Tony Fabrizio, have warned that efforts to shave down vaccine recommendations may not matter much to most voters this fall. I've worked with Tony Fabrizio. If Tony is telling the president and everybody else that this isn't going to matter, this isn't going to matter. You got people like Frank Luntz, who says nothing in America matters more than affordability. And anytime the administration Republicans go off affordability, they're not talking about what Americans really care about. And Whit Ayers has said Trump's announcement does not strike me as the most persuasive political messaging. Trump is talking about things voters don't care about, and we're starting to see those numbers matter in the states we talked about earlier, like Michigan and Wisconsin.
I'll just pick up quickly on the Whit Ayers quote there. Whit Ayers is someone that I respect a great deal. He's, in my mind, the best Republican pollster working today. He's a former guest on my podcast. When he says, maybe this isn't in our best strategic interest, the translation is, you're out of your freaking mind. What are you doing? So let me turn that question to you, Matt. We are only a few weeks past stories about the White House trying to rein in our Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his folks over at DHS from their jihad against vaccines, especially childhood vaccines. But now there's this switch around this executive order. What are Republicans behind closed doors? What are they saying about this?
It is a complete mess right now. This is not what we need to be talking about. Yes, Maha likes this. They love this. And this is a nod to that group who Trump feels got him elected. I suspect when you start to look at the scorecard, Democrats are probably still maintaining a pretty solid ground.
Yes, exactly as you suggested. Pretty flat on Trump's approval numbers, his approval numbers with independents. Both of them absolute toilet territory, as you've alluded to on this show several times. The big one to notice here is the generic ballot. I talked last week about the fact that Real Clear polling had put Democrats into this plus 7.2 territory. This is a more reactive polling average. It tends to bounce around a little bit more because of their methodology. But Nate Silver over at Silver Bulletin is a lot more cautious. And now his generic ballot margin is creeping into the exact same territory. So that is a major positive for Democrats coming out of this week.
Now, last week you talked about likely voters, and Nate Silver brought that up this week. What are you seeing with likely voters? How's that starting to impact? How's that impacting the scorecard right now?
What Nate Silver did this past week, and we can get more into this in a moment, is he put out his model, his prediction model. Obviously, he's one of the most well-known and closely watched forecasters, election forecasters working today. He was sort of the OG of the field using this kind of data-intensive approach. He reached the same conclusion that I was speaking to a couple of weeks ago, which is that pollsters tend to make that switch from registered voters over to likely voters somewhere around nowish. And so what you can anticipate in the next few weeks is that more polls are going to switch over to that likely voter model. And what we've seen in other polls is that likely voters are trending toward Democrats. And that's a switch from 2 years ago in 2024. Nate Silver got there a slightly different way. He got to the same conclusion by saying, look at the turnout. It's what you were alluding to in Michigan and Wisconsin earlier. The turnout has been just gangbusters for Democrats, something like a 5.6% turnout advantage across all the special elections, 117 of them that have occurred since the presidential last year. So he gets to the same conclusion by a different route. But either way, what we can expect is those generic ballot numbers, all of the polling numbers, to start to look a couple of points better for Democrats over the next couple of weeks.
All right. So you've gone through all this stuff. What's your bottom line this week?
I don't love handing week after week toward the Democrats. Still, it's hard to take a week where you see this drift toward Democrats in a major measure of the generic ballot and not give it to the Democrats. And of course, the other thing that you can point to is that this is the first week that we've seen Democrats pull ahead on poly market as being more likely to take over the US Senate. They've been trailing Republicans on that measure in a prediction market. Now, look, prediction markets, there are issues, there are structural issues, right?
Mhm.
That said, it is another tiny brick in the wall that says things are just continuing to trend toward the Democrats. So my verdict was a slight lean toward the Democrats for this week. You?
I think all indicators right now for Republicans are we're going to have a very bad November. Something dramatically has to change for that, which is why I think your scorecard keeps showing every week trending towards Democrats. Yes, I think we're going to win Michigan. I think it puts the Senate much more challenging for Democrats still to be able to gain control, but I think they will, because I do think Alaska, I think North Carolina, I think Iowa, these are all states that are in play that should not be. Texas keeps going back and forth. I saw a poll where Paxton's finally ahead, but it's only a point or two. So I still think we probably win Texas, but I think we're going to spend a lot of money for it. I am not feeling good about Republicans' chances because even when you look at these House races, we're now having to defend some scandal-ridden members of Congress who refuse to resign, like Max Miller. All the indicators are bad for us, and our Hail Mary pass was socialism, and that's only going to impact some swing voters unless one of these candidates say something just completely crazy that can change this dynamic. Otherwise, Republicans have a problem, and we got to fix it. We still have time, but we're just not doing it.
And that's why each weekly verdict has been leaning toward the Democrats or fully toward the Democrats, because we keep getting in new numbers, or it's just another week of lost opportunities. But look, if people don't like the structural indicators, if they don't think that prediction markets are really much of an analytical tool, you can always point to real economic numbers. And we just saw this week, the economy shed 23,000 jobs in July. There was a downward revision to May and June. Unemployment, the rate actually fell, but that's because so many people are discouraged and have stopped even trying to look for work. Right. And most important is that wage growth has slowed. And so to me, that's the biggest indication of them all, that this cake of economic perception is baked. At this point, is just about baked, ready to take out of the oven. That is the biggest impediment to Republicans doing anything at all this fall. That probably bummed you out, made me happy, but you're not feeling fantastic about it. So let's give everyone a little dose of hope.
There are cameras popping up all along roads across America called flock cameras. Now, you've probably seen some of the stories. It was on Fox News and CNN. They scan license plates, record where cars were seen, and feed that information into a database police departments can search. Flock says it has around 120,000 cameras across the country. Police departments say they help solve crime, recover stolen cars, and find suspects faster. But critics are stacking up. They're citing alleged police misuse, privacy right violations, and mass surveillance. Dayton, Ohio suspended its Flock system after an audit found more than 7,000 searches connected to immigration enforcement by outside agencies. Connecticut discovered out-of-state agencies accessing Connecticut camera information for immigration investigations. Reporting has identified numerous cases in which police officers allegedly use Flock databases to track girlfriends, former partners, or other people for personal reasons, which led to something truly amazing. People started getting involved. They started asking who has access to this information. They started showing up at city council meetings. They started demanding answers from police departments and elected officials. And this movement is crossing party lines. Progressives see a surveillance system that can be used for immigration enforcement. Conservatives see government building a giant database tracking where Americans drive. And for once, the left and the right looked at the same government program and both said, yeah, that seems creepy. And the pressure is working. The Flock CEO has now announced major changes. Now look at that. Americans learned what their government was doing, got pissed off, left the couch, and actually did something about it. And that may be the best thing about this whole Flock controversy and why I chose it as a dose of hope, because it's a reminder that we, the people, still mean something. Because every once in a while, a bunch of regular people can walk into a government meeting and remind everybody in the room exactly who works for whom.
Last week, I told you to look up. Look up at the 6 planets that would be visible in a line in the sky. Look up at the solar eclipse. Look up at the Perseid meteor shower. And it seems like many of you listened. But unfortunately, one family in New Jersey really didn't, and we just found out this week exactly what hit their house back in July 2024. A meteorite weighing more than 2 pounds, doesn't sound that impressive, but if it's going at supersonic speeds, it's a lot, tore through the roof of a home in Hillsborough, New Jersey, after a daytime fireball streaked across the New York City area and produced a sonic boom just south of the Statue of Liberty. Scientists just published this week their full analysis of what was in that meteorite in the journal Science Advances, and it turns out to be one of the most scientifically valuable meteorites recovered in years. It's a rare type of carbonaceous chondrite, a primitive carbon-rich rock that's barely changed since the solar system formed 4.5 billion years ago. Inside it, researchers found evidence of ancient concentrated salty brines on the parent asteroid that the meteorite came from, only the second meteorite of this type ever recovered. It also contained a wide range, and this is the key point here, of amino acids and complex carbon-based organic compounds, the actual building blocks of life. Not life itself, but the raw ingredients. Now, look, I'm about to super duper nerd out on all of you people, and I hope you'll bear with me, because this gets into territory that has been long explored in the kind of science fiction that I secretly love to read and watch. And it turns out that this idea that the building blocks of life may have fallen to Earth has been long explored in that type of speculative fiction. And beyond that, it's been explored by real serious scientists who believe it's quite possible not only that the ingredients of life fell to Earth 4.5 billion years ago from the heavens, but also if they were available on these kinds of rocky surfaces and interstellar ice, they could have been seeded in neighboring star systems. And therefore, neighboring stars could have biological life forms on the planet circling them that are our distant biological cousins. This is an idea, panspermia, that was explored in this year's biggest movie hit, Project Hail Mary. So it's a little bit current in pop culture, just a little bit. But look, I feel hopeful about this because once again, all of these stories remind us that our petty little problems here on Earth are not much. And we may have some distant cosmic relatives who share the same problems, hopes, dreams, faults. Donald Trump's new hair wig, wherever that came from, also from a distant meteorite. And I'll just say that I closed out last week's Dose of Hope by saying that if everything else fails, and if we end up with horrible candidates for president in 2028, then as an expedient, we could all root for a giant meteor to hit. I didn't think that all the giant meteors out there might be listening. So I'm very sorry for that New Jersey family who had their house caved in. Hopefully they were protected by a thick layer of hair gel and pecking plants. But this is definitely the kind of giant meteor we can all root for. And on that hopeful note, for Matt, I'm Matt. We'll see you next time.